Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I do want to let everyone know we will start promptly at 1:01. That is just to allow all of our attendees into the meeting room. So please bear with us for the next 2 minutes as everyone joins the webinar. Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I do want to welcome you to our webinar. We are going to get started promptly at 1:01, just to allow all of our attendees into the meeting room. So please bear with us for the next 60 seconds as we allow the rest of our attendees in, and we will get started very shortly. All right, I have 1:01 on the dot. Thank you for joining us for our LPF webinar with our awesome bachelor level partner and sponsor of this webinar, Prime Communication, sponsoring this educational opportunity for the industry. So thank you, Prime Communication. Before we get started, I do want to talk a little bit about logistics for our webinar. First and foremost, the webinar is being recorded. So if you have a bad internet connection or you lose connection or you are not able to attend, you will be able to view the webinar tomorrow with the post-webinar email that you will receive. Everyone is muted to minimize disruption for the audience. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A box within the Zoom platform to ask those directly to the facilitators. We do hold all questions to the end of the webinar before we verbalize those to our panelists. So please keep that in mind. We have two amazing speakers with us today. First and foremost, we have Brian Freeman, VP of National Accounts with Prime Communications. Good afternoon, Brian. How are you today?
Good afternoon. I am doing, actually good morning for me, Matt. I'm here in beautiful Mesa, Arizona, but very, very excited to be here today.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Brian has been involved in the physical security industry since 2005, holding various positions such as Vice President of North America for Verint Video Critical Infrastructure Division, President of Centaur's U.S. Operations, as well as Vice President of Sales for Uptelios and Vigilant Robotics. He joined Prime Communications back in 2014, and for the past 3 years, has been focused on assisting retail clients with securing their distribution centers and stores with the application of IP video, card access, metal detectors, turnstiles, and other physical security solutions. He is an active supporter and partner of the Loss Prevention Foundation and the Loss Prevention Research Council. So thank you for all that you are doing within the loss prevention and retail industry, Brian. Very, very amazing.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
Our other amazing speaker and subject matter expert in hostile events preparation is Jerry Wilkins. Jerry, good morning, or good morning, sir, wherever you are.
I'm on the East Coast. Good morning to you. It's a sunny day here.
Excellent, sir. So Jerry comes with a plethora of experience. Jerry is an ASIS board certified physical security professional. He's been through and graduated the FBI Citizens Academy. He's also a firearms instructor, NRA range safety officer, and holds various certifications that you can see on your screen. And we are very excited to allow Jerry the opportunity to give us some expertise in our webinar platform on hostile events preparation is not optional. Originally, this was more of active shooter and workplace violence type training. COVID-19 was not a hot topic when we first started preparing for this webinar. So be mindful of that as Jerry presents the content and moves forward. But before Brian turns it over to Jerry, I do want to give Brian the opportunity to talk a little bit about how Prime Communications supports the retail sector. Brian?
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. As Matt said, I'm Brian Freeman, Vice President of National Account Sales for Prime Communications. I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. Obviously, the retail industry is suffering at levels never seen before. And Prime Communications is proud to be hosting this webinar today in order to give back to an industry that is hurting. And we appreciate your contribution to that effort, so thank you. I'm sure that many of you are working from home for the first time to attend this webinar. Even with the challenges that presents, I hope that you're getting more done and able to spend some additional time with your family. Although it wasn't, as Matt said, it wasn't front of mind for us when we initially started planning the webinar. COVID-19 has definitely highlighted the need for us to all have executable plans in place to address events such as active shooters, severe weather, or threats that you can't see like this virus. With that in mind, we're not here to sell you anything today, and believe me, for a guy who's been in sales his entire life, that's a tough ask. But we are here to hopefully educate you, raise your awareness, and provide you with some ideas on how you can be part of making your organization stronger in times of crisis. Prime Communications' core business is assisting our retail clients in their pursuit of securing their facilities and providing a safe working environment for their personnel and visitors. As you can see from the screen, we've got a broad set of solutions that, when combined, can certainly provide a very solid platform in order to accomplish just that. But it was because of that passion that we have that we met Jerry Wilkins, who you'll be hearing from momentarily. Jerry has been a great partner to us and has done an excellent job raising our awareness of how we can make a difference, not only with our clients, but with our own employees and their families. I have a very strong feeling that he will have that same impact on you today. I want to thank you in advance for your participation, and I sincerely hope that you find today's webinar to be not only informative, but a good use of your time. I encourage you to ask questions so that we can have a strong dialogue around this important and critical initiative. And please feel free to contact me on LinkedIn so that we can continue the conversation. And with that, I'll turn things over to our distinguished guest, Jerry Wilkins. Jerry?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Matt. Folks, it's a pleasure to be with you today. As the gentleman said earlier, when we initially put this together, we really were looking at the threat of active shooter or workplace violence, whichever the case may be, and the importance of planning for those events. We're going to show an example in just a couple minutes of where planning was not proper and not properly executed, and as a result, created some liability and some potential, because of some potential negligence. But I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about planning for a critical incident, or as FEMA puts it, an all-hazard event, it doesn't really matter what the event is. The planning process remains the same. So when we think about planning for a pandemic, or when we think about planning for a tornado or a flood or a major power outage, the planning process remains the same. And unfortunately, because of risk, liability, and negligence, it's not an option not to have a plan. Now, specific to active shooter and workplace violence, we are going to be covering some best practices as they relate to first responders. There will be some recent events that we're going to talk about. But I think it's important to understand that the things that we show today are not coming from Jerry Wilkins. I'm presenting these, but these are all best practices that are grounded in fact, as we have uncovered from either the Loss Prevention Foundation, the National Fire Protection Association, OSHA, FEMA, NRF. So what we've tried to do is collect data for you that you can utilize when putting together a proper plan. Next slide, please. Now, what we're about to show, and I actually hate to use this, but we're going to use it today, is some information from the Parkland shooting where there was a plan. There were a lot of things in place, but nothing had been practiced. So one of the keys to any plan is that it be properly practiced. So if we could start the video of the interview with the...
So he's just out the homework, walking on the campus through the bike rack gate. So he starts coming, he's beelining. He's got his head down, he's on a mission, you know, he's on a mission. He sees my golf cart and he starts running to the building, inside the building. Right when he starts running inside the building, I'm naive, I'm kind of chasing him to go get, you know, like pull up in front of the building to go in and see what he's kind of doing. I knew it. I'm telling you, I knew who the kid was because we had a meeting about him last year and we said if there's going to be anybody who's going to come into school and shoot the school up, it's going to be that kid. Not even a minute after he was in, I heard the first bang, like, bah! And I'm like, uh-oh. Right? I'm like, what? So I got back in the golf cart, I'm starting to turn, I'm getting out.
Next slide.
So he's just out the...
And go ahead and start the animation.
17 Juliet 3, 17 Bravo 3, 17 Bravo 4.
17 Juliet 3, we have possible, could be firecrackers. I think we got shots fired. Possible shots fired. 12.
Seventeen Juliet 3, 17 Bravo 3, 17 Bravo 4.
17 Juliet 3, we have possible, could be firecrackers. I think we got shots fired. Possible shots fired. 1200 building.
Attention all units in District 15, possible shots fired at 5901 Pine Island Road at Stoneman Douglas High School. Possible shots fired at Stoneman Douglas High School.
You can go ahead and advance.
Somebody with the camera system ASAP. Where's the principal? Who's with the principal? And we need to start making a plan here. They are monitoring the subject right now. He went from the third floor to the second floor. Third to the second floor. He may have a gas mask on now. Stand by for further. They're monitoring him on camera. Stand by for further. He dropped the bag near the stairwell. Stand by for further. Golf 1 on 48. Is that from recording? He's exiting the school? Yes, sir. They're following him. It's about a 20-minute delay. They're following him on video, on the camera. They had him exiting the building, running south.
Attention all units, if you can hear me on this radio, be advised the radios are having malfunctions. You can hear me, but I cannot hear you, so stand by.
So further advised, all cities, all radios be advised to keep your traffic to a minimum. With each transmission, it's causing it to crash. It's overloaded right now.
Next. So unfortunately, our timing was just a little bit off on that, but I'm going to explain what you just saw. You had an animation on the left-hand part of your screen. In fact, it's still running, that shows the shooter's movements through the building. The animation came out literally days after the event. I want everybody to think for just a second, where did that animation come from? Well, the animation came from the video surveillance that was deployed in the school. There was a high definition video system. In fact, it was relatively new, but unfortunately it wasn't part of the plan. In this particular case, the shooter was in and out of the facility in 7 minutes, but for 58 minutes, no medical attention was allowed in the building because they didn't realize the shooter had left. So it was a total, in my opinion, failure of utilizing available resources. Next slide, please. Now, what came out of that? And that's really what we're going to talk about today. What came out of that are significant numbers of lawsuits. And they're lawsuits that are based on the fact that the school failed to provide adequate security. Now, the reality, the adequate security was there. The policies and procedures were there. It's just they had never been practiced. You know, everybody talks about, well, we have a plan, we have a plan. Well, a plan is only as good as the amount of practice that you put into it. Our research tells us you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of training. So whenever we develop a plan, whether it's a pandemic plan, a major flood plan, active shooter or workplace violence plan, we have to understand that that plan has to, A, be simple, and it has to be something that our people can go to immediately when needed. Next slide, please. One of the things that troubles me the most when I talk to folks, we spend a lot of time talking with people about this exact formula. And I ask people, can you tell me what this formula is? Well, it's a very simple risk formula. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact over countermeasures. Now, as we just saw in the Parkland example, this question could be asked and the answer would be, we didn't. How do you currently resource type? Resource type is a FEMA term for categorizing by capability your technology solutions, your video, your access control, your mass notification, and let's take it another step further with COVID. Your policies and procedures, your ingress egress policies, your availability of PPE, the way your facility may be set up for CPTED as part of your all hazard critical incident response. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about all hazard events. Active shooter workplace violence is now considered by FEMA to be an all hazard event. So it's something that when we get into our next planning cycle, which I'm sure this COVID-19 is going to force a lot of businesses to rethink the way they've prepared for potential issues in the future. The emergency operations plan they've established, the specific threat annexes that they've established. This would be a great question to integrate into that process to ensure we don't overlook the resources that we have. Next slide, please. Now, we always wonder, well, what are our top 10 threats? Well, if you ask anybody today, they would tell you it's COVID-19. But if we look at a survey that was put out back in 2018, next slide, we would actually see that active shooter was number 2. Cyber, internet, intranet security was number 1. But active shooter was number 2, workplace violence was number 3. Now, the reality is when we look at active shooter events, they're in essence workplace violence events because it's violence that occurs in the workplace. However, now any workplace violence event that has 4 or more casualties, according to the FBI, are classified as active shooter events. Now, the next one, which I think is going to move up very quickly, is business continuity. So how are we going to improve our business continuity planning? Next slide. One of the important things to keep in mind, Advance, is that active shooter was said by Department of Homeland Security that 2/3 of all of these events, whether it be workplace or violence or active shooter events, will end up in some sort of civil liability. So if you have an active shooter event and you don't have a plan in place, you can anticipate not only having civil liability, but more than likely losing that case. Next slide, please. If there's any question, we'll just scroll through these very quickly. These types of events, and we had a real rash summer of last year, these types of events are happening everywhere. Next slide. One of the things that I found very interesting, back in August of last year, the Wall Street Journal ran an article where it's indicated that some corporations now are actually disclosing the potential of an active shooter event having a negative impact on their share value. Now, what's important to remember about that, if we identify it to our shareholders, we've certainly acknowledged that it is a potential threat in our place of business. And I think in today's world, not to recognize the potential of an active shooter or a workplace violence event evolving into something that becomes a disaster is not something we want to do. We need to have a plan. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at Loss Prevention Magazine, they wrote a great article where they talked about lawsuits that have been involved in workplace violence, workplace bullying. There is a significant liability exposure if there's not a workplace violence plan in place. That includes not only what the employees are supposed to do, but how each rung of the ladder is supposed to respond when there's evidence or mention of a workplace incident occurring. Next slide, please. SHRM put out a great article where they actually talked about over the last 15 years, 48% of the deaths in the retail environment have been violent deaths. So from a retail standpoint, this is absolutely not something that we can say it can't happen here. Now, also SHRM mentioned OSHA's general duty clause. It's actually 5.A.1, which is in fact a citable offense through OSHA. And it's one of the few things I've ever seen the federal government write that can be done on one single sheet of paper. But it's pretty simple. Shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. So when we think about COVID-19, especially in our grocery environment or in what they talk about as required employment, those folks have to be at work. Have we recognized COVID-19 currently as a problem, and are we taking reasonable steps to protect them? There was a recent article came out earlier this week where one of the major retailers is issuing PPE, personal protection equipment, to all of their associates to ensure that they have not only the equipment, but how to use it. Next slide, please. So what we're really going to talk about, and I'm sure this is something that we're all familiar with, but I just want to take a minute and recover some of the very basic things we need to think about. When we think about risk in that risk equation, active shooter is not a risk. Active shooter, coronavirus, tornado, those are threats. What makes us vulnerable to those threats? A risk is very simple. It's something that can have a positive or negative outcome on our business. And it's interesting in this ANSI, as is RIM's definition, it talks about tangible and intangible assets. Our people, our place of business, but also our standing in the community. How do people look at us after we've had an event that maybe we didn't deal with well? And it goes on to explain that risk is a component of threats times vulnerabilities times consequences. Next slide. And this is not something I made up. This is something that came directly out of one of the FEMA trainings that I've taken. So you've got a backup. It's clearly documented what a risk is, what threats are, man-made occurrences, or natural occurrences, and what makes us vulnerable. What can we be doing to improve our, again, a FEMA term, our resilience to this type of event? Next slide, please. Liability, this can be summarized very simple. what did we do or not do to protect our people? Now, what we didn't do in many cases is as important as what we should have done. And when it talks about the evidence of a duty to act, well, if we go back to the general duty clause where it says we are required to provide a safe workplace, then all of a sudden this liability issue becomes more important. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about what we could or couldn't do, we have to look for places to find standards of care or best practices, whether it be regulatory guidance type issues or regulatory compliance type issues, where there's a law associated with it or just a reasonable location to find data to improve our security. But in my mind, next slide, the very best, back up just one for me, the very best practice to follow is to have an emergency operations plan. When I use that risk formula and I speak to people, I make the assumption that there's an emergency operations plan in place. In other words, an overall way where we've used a THIRA type concept, where we've identified our threats and hazards and we've put it into the context of risk. And those risks that we find to be our highest concern, we actually look at how do we mitigate. Mitigate is a word we've heard time and time again over the last 30 days. How are we going to mitigate that threat and vulnerability? Well, it's my opinion we do it through countermeasures. And as I mentioned, those could be technology, they could be SEPTED, could be any number of things. But the key thing we have to start with is an emergency operations plan. Next slide, please. So you're probably asking yourself, where do we go to find this? Well, just as I stated in my opening, there are all types of open source documents available to you. Now, I happen to just recently have completed the Loss Prevention Foundation training, which I've not been able to test yet. The testing centers are down, but LPF has actually stepped up and is looking for a way for us to test without that. But I have to tell you that it was excellent training, extremely comprehensive, a lot of material, but it addresses many of the things I'm talking about right now. So we've got a number of locations we can look to for this information. Next slide, please. Now, it all comes down to, after we've looked at our risk, we've looked at our best practices, is liability is created by negligence. And negligence is one of the simplest things to really understand, yet at the same time, one of the most difficult things. It talks about legal duty. When you invite someone into your place of business, or when you ask someone to come to your facility to go to work, you have an obligation to keep that person safe. You have an obligation to have followed best practice to ensure your facility is safe. So what if something goes wrong? Have you breached that duty? Now we're going to skip number 3 for just a second and jump right down to damages or injury. When we talk about the subject that we actually put this together for, which is active shooter, and I hate to put it this simplistically, but when we look at damages or injury in an active shooter, we're basically counting the chalk lines. And I know that's a horrible way to put it, but it's a fact. So what is the proximate cause? Well, it's basically that liability piece, what we did or didn't do, actions that we took or didn't take to ensure we had a safe facility. Next slide, please. Now, again, in our world, in the retail world, it's happening everywhere. Not only in grocery stores, especially in distribution centers. There's been a couple of those recently. YouTube headquarters. I mean, there's no place that is immune from having this type of event occur. And the outcomes are typically tragic. Next slide, please. But if we look to, again, to the loss prevention training, they have a great section in it where it gives the same exact examples that the FBI would give you of what is an active shooter. Well, it's simply someone in your facility trying to take other lives. And it gives you a little definition. It typically happens very quickly. It's unpredictable. I get all that. But we have to have a plan. Next slide, please. When you actually look at the components, again, that come directly out of the LPF training, it says you have to have a plan. It says it talks about the value of practical training, and it encourages you to understand fundamental response. Well, we're going to get into that very briefly right now. Next slide. When we really look at the response puzzle, it has three pieces. We have our victims, we have our first responders, and then of course we have our property stakeholders. What is the role of each of those individuals? Next slide. Before we get to that, I'm going to read, and I don't like to read slides, but I'm going to read the very last line that's in yellow here so that we all hear it. That responsibility falls on the shoulders of our loss prevention team, our managers, and our associates. We must have a practical and actionable plan in place to help protect our associates and our customers, keeping everyone as safe as possible until help arrives. So it's clearly stating that our failure not to plan is really going to be our biggest problem. Next slide. So the importance of planning. What can we do from the property stakeholder standpoint? Well, there's a number of things. These situations will be chaotic and they'll be horrific. I've done every type of training I can. I've never been involved in an actual active shooter, but a lot of the simulations we did were very scary. Next slide, please. Again. So where can we look? Well, if we look at Nfpa 3000, this is a document that came out back in May of 2018. They have a comprehensive document to help you develop an ASHER program, Active Shooter Hostile Event Response Plan or program. Interestingly enough, it talks about planning for, responding to, and recovering from, and then it goes on to say that it's defensible, it's adaptable, and it's integratable. So it's a plan that anybody can use, and everybody says, oh, well, it's such a long document. Well, if anybody tells you that, they haven't read it, because it's 42 pages and it's an extremely good document. I highly recommend it. Next slide. Go ahead and fly all those in. Just to give you some, back one, just to give you some examples. It will help you conduct a risk assessment of your facility. It will help you to design your response techniques. It will help you better understand what other types of training are available to you. So again, if you're at wit's end and you're saying, how am I going to put this active shooter plan together? Here's a document that you can follow to do that. We use these every day. Next slide, please. Now, it also talks about the value of practical training. How are we going to get our associates trained? Can you fly that out for me? There's all types of training available to you, both paid and free. DHS offers a training program. It's actually on their independent studies website. It's IS 907. It's a 1-hour program, and it fully details run, hide, fight. One of the difficulties I have with this, it's only 1 hour, it's online, and it doesn't give you a chance to practice it. So it's got some drawbacks there. Avoid, Deny, Defend was actually created in conjunction with TEACS and the FBI. And then you have ALICE, which is another excellent training program. I've become instructors in all of these. I think they're all great, but if you're gonna do it, you have to have not only a plan, but a practical way to test that plan, to actually run that plan. Next slide, please. When we talk about the fundamentals of response, I think it's critical to understand what's gonna happen if you have an active shooter event or a workplace violence event. How is law enforcement going to respond? If you could fly that out for me. Well, in today's world, unlike 20 years ago when we experienced Columbine, we're seeing our law enforcement agencies being trained on solo engagement tactics, where they're teaching officers to identify and react to these events individually or in small groups, so that they're going to come in and they're going to try and save you. Next slide, please. When we look at what our medics are doing, in the old days, the medics only staged outside, but now we're doing something called tactical emergency casualty care, where we're actually embedding medics into SWAT stacks so that we can put medicine on people much more quickly. Next slide, please. Again, in the old days, we ran hot and cold zones. Hot zones were where the badge and gun guys went. Cold zones were where the medics stayed. But now we have a classification called warm zone. The reality is, in the example you saw at Parkland, That location became a cold zone at 7 minutes. The shooter entered and exited in 6 minutes and 58 seconds. They could have easily surged medics, but because of the lack of utilization of technology, those medics did not know that it was safe to either embed and consider it a warm zone or go in on their own. Next slide, please. Again, additional guidance is readily available to you through OSHA. OSHA created a document, it's called OSHA 3153, which will provide late night retail guidance on the use of video surveillance, the use of deal trays, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Now, interestingly enough, back in 2014, the NRF, the National Retail Federation, produced a document on protocols for active shooters, extremely well written, especially well written for the time that it was done back in 2014. But these are the types of documents that are out there that can become real paper tigers. There is guidance within the industry that could be considered a best practice that the failure to follow could create liability. Next slide, please. What's happening? Well, if we look at the El Paso Walmart shooting, the lawsuits started popping up immediately in that particular event. The US government's being sued. Next slide, please. And in one very interesting article that came out in the, gosh, what was it? One of the Dallas-Fort Worth papers talks about the law firm that is actually suing Walmart, one of the law firms, because there's multiple lawsuits in place right now, or at least according to open source there is. One of the first things that the law firm asked for in their pre-litigation filings was the information you see. What was your active shooter program? How many of your stores had security guards? Had you done a comprehensive THIRA, which is part of looking at the criminal history or the criminal activity within a certain radius of your facility? Did you properly plan for this event? Did you think through whether it was Corona, active shooter, or again, a tornado or a hurricane? Have you thought through? Have you done what you needed to do? Now, I know that funds are always a problem when it comes to this, but when you think about it, the planning process is not terribly expensive. The technology that goes along with it can be, but it can be a multi-tiered approach where we're going to create a plan. Somebody, that's perfect. You can move on to the next slide. At the end of the day, somebody has to step up and take ownership for that risk. How are we going to deal with these risks? Now, I know you have risk managers, you have loss prevention people, you have IT people, but the problem is, just as you see on the left hand of your screen, those become silos. Well, any critical incident looks more like the silo on the right. One of those silos breaks open. Unless we come up with a way to comprehensively address our critical incidents, whatever they may be, and that's something that only you can determine. What do we want to address? What makes the most sense to address? How can we save the most lives? How can we avoid the greatest amount of liability? We have to, as a group, not as a security department or an IT department or an HR department, but as a group, we have to break down those silos and work together, not only to identify what's keeping us up at night, but how are we going to deal with it? Next slide, please. So one of the things that came out, again, out of the LPF training was crisis response, and it actually addresses incident command. One of the things that I find most effective to prepare for any of these events is to utilize, and again, it comes right out of FEMA, their incident command structure. Next slide. Incident command was actually designed back in 1968, was somewhat codified in 1970. But incident command is used regularly by fire departments, regularly by large corporations when they're setting up a standardized way to deal with any incident. It requires practice, it requires training, but the biggest thing it requires is the thought to do it. Next slide, please. Anybody that's not using an incident command structure, highly recommend it. Again, the training is available for free through FEMA. The folks at Prime, we spent a great deal of time working with them to get them to understand how to be a component of your incident command structure. Next slide, please. Now, you say to yourself, well, Jerry kept talking about this emergency operations plan. If I don't have one, and I'm sure some of you do, but some of you don't, what do I do now? Well, again, we can look to open sources like the CPG 101, which is a comprehensive planning guide. It will step us through, next slide, please, the process of putting together a plan. Now, one of the things that gets talked about a lot in emergency operations and planning is, how do we test this plan? Well, again, open source document is the HSEEP, the Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Plan. So if we're looking for a way, now we've set up our plan using our CPG 101. Our next step is, how are we going to practice this plan? How are we going to continue this loop of planning, practicing, rethinking what we did, replanning, repracticing? All of that information is available to you through these open source methods. Next slide, please. This document, this HSEEP, will give you a checklist pretty much by vertical of how to put together one of these plans. So first we develop our emergency operations plan after we've done our threat assessment. So we've identified, okay, active shooter workplace violence. That's something we need to think about. The potential of a pandemic, that's something we need to think about. We're in Tornado Alley. We need to have a tornado plan in place. Now we build our plan around it, and then we figure out a way to exercise it so it's second nature. Again, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our level of training. And as we like to tell people, under stress, the only thing you'll do is that which you've been well trained. So if you train until you get it right, you've not trained enough. You have to train until you can't get it wrong. So the training steps, the actual response processes have to be very, very simple to execute. Next slide, please. Again, coming back to the exercise plan, it will lay it out for you completely. How do we create our priorities? How do we create our objectives? And what are the core capabilities within our organization? And what are the core capabilities for those responding agencies? What can we expect to see when they arrive on scene? And how can we improve the outcome, not only for ourselves, but our first responders, by being part of that solution? The first person on scene is not the first responders. You're the first person there. You have to take responsibility. Next slide, please. So I promised I would get through this in 40 minutes or less, and I'm coming up on that time now. Hostile events, they can happen anywhere. Pandemics, this is one of the first times that I ever remember that we've had an incident that impacted not only our entire country, but our entire world. Now, a lot of people want to say they're low probability. The probability of this happening again is extremely low. The probability in reality of you having an active shooter event at your facility is relatively low. But the consequences are always severe, even if no one is injured. The consequence to your reputation, all of those factors fit into your risk profile. The other big problem is the liability that results. I don't even want to imagine what the liability is going to come out of this pandemic, whether it's planning or lack of planning. And the resources have to be utilized that are there to design and develop a defensible plan. But the key is the emergency operations plan. Next slide. So we wanted to make sure, because I'm sure this is going to, or at least I hope it generates some questions, we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So Matt, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Jerry. We do have some questions already coming in. If you have questions, please make sure that you're using the Q&A box, not the chat box, to submit those. So the very first question, Jerry, is, if I or my organization does not have a plan, where do you recommend we start?
Well, there's a couple ways to approach that. You can do it internally or you can do it externally. What I would recommend is look at some of the documents that we've provided, and this slide deck is going to be available to everyone. There's a lot of open source information out there. If you recall, we mentioned the CPG 101. There is a free open source comprehensive planning guide to address all hazard events. Active shooter is now classified as an all hazard event. So step one is that. Obviously, they can go into the private industry to seek help on that, but I'm not here to sell that concept. I'm here to offer up extremely inexpensive ways to get started. First, we develop our plan. So we utilize the CPG to put the plan together. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Thank you. Next question. How often do you recommend that plans be reviewed and tested and practiced?
Interestingly enough, I can call from industry best practice on that. Nfpa 3000 says you shall, not should, you shall practice your active shooter at minimum once a year. Now it goes on to say that that practice can be virtual, meaning and anytime you run an exercise, there's multiple levels of exercise. There's discussions, there's tabletops, there's drills, which are actual activities, there's exercises, and then there's full exercises where we would include law enforcement. NFPA simply states that you shall exercise your plan annually. So it could be something as simple as a tabletop. That really comes back to your THIRI, your threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. What have we identified? What sources are we using to identify the likelihood it could occur with us? I've got one business that does a full active shooter drill or exercise every quarter, every 3 months. But there's all different levels. The key is to be able to document that, A, we've trained our people. First, we had a plan, then we trained our people how to use the plan, and then we exercised either through discussions, tabletops, drills, exercise, full exercise, that plan with our people.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Who should be involved in the planning process and building out the action plan?
That is a phenomenal question. Whoever asked that question, thank you so much. The planning process has to be all-encompassing, according to the size of your facility. All of the key stakeholders within your facility, your security personnel, your HR personnel, your IT personnel, if you have a legal department, your legal department. But folks, here's the most critical component. Invite your first responders. Make sure you get a representative from law enforcement. Make sure you get a representative from EMS or fire services. That's critical. If you've followed the steps of creating the plan, practicing the plan, utilizing your local law enforcement, you will find that if you have a critical incident, number one, the outcome will be dramatically improved because those first responders will know what to expect at some level from you, and as importantly, what critical resources exist in your building that I can leverage during my response to keep my first responders safer and to be able to eliminate my threat as quickly as possible.
Awesome.
Jerry, if I could add to that, you know, one of the things that we see on a pretty regular basis, even for companies who have put the plan together, is that they don't take into account the use of the technology that they have, be it the video or the card access. I mean, I think there are several situations that have occurred where no one could locate what they needed, the cards, the keys to get through a certain door to get to a level where the shooter was. And in the case of the Parkline video that you sent, I don't know if the audience picked up on that, but the shooter was long gone. They were looking at old video.
Right.
And what we tend to see is that people are using the technology they have merely for the forensics analysis after the event is over, rather than using it, before, during, and after. And I think that's kind of what you're touching on there.
Well, Brian, that's an excellent point. And coming back to one of Matt's earlier questions, one of the things I left out, and I do apologize, who else should be on that committee to actually create the plan? And this is why we worked with your group, Brian, so that your guys could actually sit in that emergency operations plan. They are the subject matter experts on the technology. How can we best utilize the technology? Unfortunately, what we find in the industry today, in a lot of cases, we want to sell this amazing technology we have today the same way we did 20 years ago. We weren't involved in the response process, but we live in a world now where we can't afford not to be involved in the risk, the threat, the vulnerability, and the response process. How can we leverage those electronic countermeasures? So Brian, that's a great point. And again, that was a big thing that we stress with your team. How do we engage in this conversation so that video doesn't get left out? Now, if I can just go on for just a second, there was an event that occurred in June of 2014 where there were two law enforcement officers sitting in a restaurant having lunch. The only crime they had committed was they were having lunch, and two bad guys came in and executed him. And they ran into a local establishment close by. It happened to be a very large retailer, and started a shooting spree in the retailer. Well, the way the law enforcement were able to terminate that event so quickly was because of the type of retailer it was. Law enforcement was very familiar with their with their video surveillance. The second units that arrived on scene immediately went to the video room, and in essence were the forward observer. They were the sniper spotter. They were able to locate the individual, get the law enforcement team on the individuals, and eliminate the threat very quickly. Now, unfortunately, in the after-action report of that particular event, and after-action reports are huge, they never mention the video. But the video was, in fact, what gave the law enforcement officers not only their bravery and their ability to shoot straight, but that gave them the intel they needed to quickly eliminate that threat. Now, if we rewind to just a minute, to last summer, the shooting that occurred in Virginia Beach, for some 30-odd minutes, law enforcement was unable to access the shooter who had barricaded himself in a stairwell because they didn't have an access control card. But the reality is, if access control had been part of the response procedure, every access control panel that I'm aware of, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, has got a web application, and in most cases has a cell phone application where they could have pulsed that door and more rapidly eliminated the threat and got medical services to the individuals that were injured. So having your technology provider or your consultant that's developing your technology solution involved in that emergency operations planning process is absolutely critical.
Couldn't agree more with that, Jerry. Great response and great call outs there. We have several other great questions coming in, so thank you to our audience. Here's the next one. Are there active shooter videos out available that get the message across without creating mass panic? Many organizations want a softer approach to communicate the hazard to their employee base.
Absolutely. California has an excellent video. If you actually Google active shooter training videos, there's a bunch of good ones. Yale recently produced one, and you can imagine if Yale produced something, it's very, very low key in the way it's approached. But yes, there's a lot of open source information out there and videos, but at the end of the day, one of the real keys is it's got to be drilled. You know, people have got to think about it. And here's the other important thing that I would want everybody to consider. Anything that you teach your employee in your workplace will aid that employee anywhere they go. So if they're in the mall and they've been trained on what to do in the event of an active shooter event, they've got a much higher likelihood of surviving that event. what is the cost of onboarding a new employee? So there's, and you know, I really hate to say it that way, but there's an economic value into saving someone's life, whether they're on the clock or off the clock, because it's very difficult to replace people.
Well said, sir. Here's an interesting question for you. Should your legal team and an insurance company be approving your action plan?
Would be a great idea.
Okay. What is the best practice for reviewing real-time video in an active situation? Because I find it difficult to plan out who is going to do this while a shooter is inside the facility when we are trained to run, hide, or evacuate. How do we decide who and how real-time video is executed and communicated to law enforcement?
That's actually a great question. And it comes back to this incident command structure. Yes, the rank and file are going to run, hide, fight. Someone at that facility is going to have some responsibility for that facility, whether it's the employees, whatever the case may be. A properly designed plan would include a security operations center, which could be a closet that has the ability with comms established in the closet and video capability established in a secure closet, in not something that's providing concealment, but something that's actually providing cover so that they can be that forward observer. But again, I'm going to recommend back to IS 100. We recommend this to all of our students. It's a great way to understand how incident command works. And according to, again, coming back to NFPA 3000 for a minute, now that's only been adopted in one jurisdiction that I'm aware of, and that's Augusta. But I see it being adopted nationwide over time. But it says every organization shall, not should, shall utilize a NIMS ICS protocol. So having an internal protocol to address that is critical, especially from the liability standpoint.
Well, and I think, Jerry, it also goes, as you've been stressing today, to the planning side of it and involving those technology providers to be an integral part of that plan. You know, to what you were describing a moment ago, you could also add in there a mobile application to where you have your key personnel that are, you know, in coordination with law enforcement, first responders, in order to be either sharing that video with them or relaying what they're seeing to them in real time to where effective action can be taken.
Absolutely. And that kind of ties in with this next question for you guys. How should private business partners and government plan together on an action plan? So, you know, with fire departments, oftentimes they know where the Knox key is to get into the building in the event that there's a fire and the building is locked down. How do you do something similar where you train your law enforcement partners to know where the technology is, how to access it, and how to leverage that resource if nobody is available?
That's actually a great question. Let's go back to who should be on the planning team. When we're developing these plans, in fact, possibly at the next step, when we actually run a drill, or as simple as a tabletop, include your first responders. They will come. Now, if they have an emergency come up when they're en route to your facility to do the drill, they may get called off to deal with that emergency, and you would expect that and you would want that. But the whole concept behind NFPA 3000, which again, I can't speak highly enough, is a community-based response program.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couple more questions and that we have left. In my jurisdiction, we have elements in which the hostile element might be part of a drug cartel, or even hostile event might be related to drug cartel violence. Is there something different that should be done or planned to normal hostile events in this scenario?
Well, the answer to that really comes back to your THIRA process, your threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. So in the THIRA process, we're going to look at our threats. Part of our THIRA process is, and again, open source availability. is we're going to look at our crime maps for our local area. What is being reported? That's going to identify those threats, those hazards. And then, yes, we may have to develop something specific for a gang-related or cartel-related type event. But typically, unless it's a mall, it's typically going to happen outside of the area. But without a doubt, that's the whole concept behind THIRA. We have to look at, number one, what are our threats and hazards? And then we have to, it's called, give them context. What does that really mean? And what risk does that pose to our business? Then we do something called an SPR, Stakeholder Preparedness Review, where we actually look at how prepared are we for this and where's our gaps. The gaps are what we have to work at, what we're capable of dealing with, what we're not capable of dealing with.
And I think this next question ties back into that on who's going to be part of that planning team. If you're a retailer with many locations throughout the country, which law enforcement agency or agencies do you recommend that you work with when building these plans? Because trying to coordinate all locally is challenging when you have sites all across the country or all across the globe.
Well, that's a great question. And it's something we need to think about. An EOP for Maine versus an EOP for California could be two totally different documents.
Mm-hmm.
The threat and hazard identification has to be done on a localized basis. Now, the beauty of that, when we start building the plan out, we're not reinventing the wheel. In other words, when we get to the point that we've identified our threats, there's a lot of commonality in the response methodology that we're going to use. But every facility should have some sort of threat and risk assessment done for that specific geographic facility, that brick and mortar location, or, well, I'll just leave it at that particular location. Make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have a preference on what source crime report you would recommend to use to research crime around your location?
Well, to me, if we had built up the proper rapport through our planning process where we invited law enforcement, we invited EMS, hey, we want you to be part of our organization. We want to help you when you are coming to help us. That would be your ideal location, because virtually all law enforcement agencies these days have some sort of proprietary crime reporting statistics. But as far as, is there an open source one I recommend? I can't really recommend anyone, but I can assure you there are plenty of them out there. Use
Absolutely.
multiple ones to get the best snapshot of your location.
I agree, Jerry, and thank you. And I know we're at 2:01, so we have a couple more slides we're going to go through real quick. I do want to thank Prime Communications for sponsoring this, as well as Jerry for the excellent presentation and education that he's providing to the industry, and for your expertise on this subject matter, Jerry. Great job. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Certainly happy to help.
Prime Communications has sponsored a promotional discount code for all the Loss Prevention Foundation certification courses, as well as our Organized Retail Crime Investigation course. The promo code is prepared in all caps. So if you are interested in getting your certification, I recommend that you use this. However, tomorrow we will be announcing that we're giving away 5 LPC scholarships in the auto response email that you'll receive with the video link to this webinar that you can share amongst your peers and amongst your colleagues to make sure that they take the value out of this conversation as well. And Brian has one more thing that he would like to talk to you about before we wrap this up. Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Jerry. A couple of things. Yeah, I'd just like to say that on behalf of Prime Communications, I want to thank our audience for their time, your consideration and participation today. It's my sincerest hope that you gain some knowledge and awareness regarding critical incident planning and response. I also want to wish you and your organization a quick recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Jerry, a big thanks to you and to our partners at the LP Foundation, Matt Schreiner and Terry Sullivan. I really appreciate your assistance and contribution today. And certainly if anyone has any questions regarding the material that we've covered, feel free to contact us, and we'll be happy to assist you with that. And then one final note, as you're seeing on your screen there, Prime will be hosting a virtual event, our Cheers and Chat, around living and working not only during the COVID-19 crisis, but after. That's going to be held on Wednesday, April the 29th, 4 to 5 p.m. Central. We're hoping that our attendees have a chance to get together and share your thoughts regarding issues that you're solving for today in this new normal that we're engaged in, as well as identifying the challenges that return to work is going to look like with the new work environment. So information is going to be coming out shortly, and we hope that you'll be able to join us and continue the dialogue. Now, the topic is serious, but we plan on having a little fun while we do it as well. So thank you again, and have a great weekend, and stay healthy.
Absolutely. Well said, Brian. We wish you all safety and health in this troubling time in our generation. We would love to see you as being part of our Loss Prevention Foundation family. Please consider becoming a Loss Prevention Foundation member, and we look forward to you attending other webinars hosted by Prime Communications as well as the Loss Prevention Foundation. Stay safe. Let us know how we can continue to support you, and we look forward to seeing you real soon. Thank you.